Okay, so here I'm going to do a late night drive, and not really late night, it's only 9 o'clock, but we're going to discuss a couple of random concepts here, almost like a recreation episode, and let me think how to get started, basically. Here's a good concept even to do with, my association of how I do these discussions. You might think, oh, I'm, very, organized or systematic with how I do the discussions, which isn't necessarily true. But it's I could be, but I want to let it be more free-flowing. And so it's kind of a life lesson that, just you want to realize that when things are structured in a certain way, it's not really done for the highest value. It's done for some lowest common denominator, okay, this will be used for the mass number of people, right? This will be used for some sort of mass scale. But like I said before, everything mass produced suffers some quality for it. So it's that by design isn't the best thing. And what's the problem with that is social contrivance is used basically as a currency in the modern day or in certain contexts because socially this and that. It's dependent over extent or pretense on a structure, so it's kind of why would you take that seriously? A person's working at a job, it's they're being all nice or something. I'd rather them be nice in their personal life, not relative to their job. This is the concept I talk about of separation. You keep them separated, the song by The Offspring or whatever, right? It's not that that's the meaning of the song. I don't even remember what the meaning of the song. You keep it separated in the sense that no, you don't want social contrivance to be used as a tool and a prompt to reinforce whatever unqualified empirical monopolization authority state, whether it be corporations, whether it be government or something. That's what it serves as a tool of reinforcement. So be nice to this nice old lady who's working at the cashier of this big multinational conglomerate that maybe doesn't have any basis to be that, or any government or anything like that. They're using them as a prompt. So it's I value that person. I value that person so much that I don't see them as a human function defined by their half-mass zero-sum means. That it's just an eventuality to get over with, to tolerate, to cope with, to deal with it. But it doesn't mean you place any special value on that. Or define them by that. I value them in their totality, not in the context of that half-mass functionalism that's unfortunate, that sort of dehumanizes them to make them a tool of that corporation or government. And all the more if you respond positively, but she's just a nice old lady, or but social contrivance is positive, but it's associated with that. It's associated with that, right? So you would separate the two. It's similar to the neutrality and amalgam theory that I talk about. It's if I value everybody on the planet the same, it would seem negative to those around me. You're being rude and mean to people around you, even though I'm being neutral. I'm treating people around me the same as I'm treating people halfway across the world, because I value them equally, so I'm not giving them special treatment based on their nearness to me. And then also, you're in a position to look at it the same way with this, I value people in their totality, not in terms of their half-mass zero-sum function. And I value, if I value social contrivance, I value it inherently, not in terms of as a tool of reinforcing dependent overextended pretense zero-sum means of them at their job, right? So So it would be separation of, like, if you value those things, you value them unconditionally, not relative to that job or human function. And so you'd be sort of neutral to that, because you realize this overextended process is not the total value or potential of a person. And so if you value them truly, you wouldn't value them in that half-mass productive context. You'd value them in all their forms and all their potential. And the same thing is true even of the same thing is true even of whatever, like the separation idea that don't let social contrivance or even your, like, the supposed value for other people and human beings be used as a selective tool and prompt to reinforce a specific contrivance state, whether it be a corporation, government, anything like that. Because that's what it turns into, is like, no, if I unconditionally value that, I value everybody everywhere, so it doesn't support a specific system or structure. I value a person in their totality, not as a human function. So it's, if I separate them from that state, just like when people associate their ego and identity with that, it's like, no, I'll be neutral, or it seems to be even rude with a cashier or with somebody working on their job, because it's neutral. It's like, it doesn't matter. I don't derive value from that. It's like, okay, it might be necessary means to an end, even though that's still overextended, but that's not who they are. That doesn't define their identity, and they're not even necessarily happy with it themselves. It's a means to an end. So I'm aware of the nature of the process instead of insisting upon it. So there's no ego in that. It's like, it's just, they're just doing their job just to do it. I'm just buying the product just to buy it, or whatever. Like, you'd separate the two. You value them, period, and you practice a zero-sum process. So you try to separate the two, like, oh, but you're being nice at your job, but you're just doing it for the money, you're tied to that. Like, associate your identity. You could say it could be a little different if, like, oh, they're a business owner or something like that, but even then they're subject to unqualified empirical kind of structures that they reinforce or are beholden to. So, like, imagine social contrivance as something else. Either you value it inherently separate from those things, or you because that's what true value would look like. It wouldn't be like that. It wouldn't be a half-assed conditional thing, like, oh, based on your that's kind of how people value things. It's like, social contrivance isn't based on standards, it's based on dependent over extended pretense, preconceived notion, nearness, like some self-benefit or perceived benefit by which you're kind of tricked and trapped. So once again, separate the social contrivance from that. It's like, oh, look how nice this person being, but then you would use that as a tool in reinforcement of literally anything. Right, so it becomes a tool of reinforcement, and one of the things that goes along with that is, like, neutrality as a false negative. That, first of all, like, people being defined and perceived in terms of their functional structured state, but it'd be seen as a zero-sum means to an end. It's not really insisted upon. So by rejecting that, it's kind of like, which is better? you sacrifice any sort of social or ego basis so that you let reality speak for itself and you don't try to exploit that or benefit from it. And so now you do it as a zero-sum process, okay, conditionally, but you don't insist upon it. You let reality speak for itself, and you are open to all things instead of defining yourself by half-mass zero-sum means function, stuff like that. Versus the flip side of it, which is you limit your infinite objective mind to your limited physical state. You define your identity by your half-mass zero-sum function, overextended by unqualified empirical authority, and then you also are in a position to do it in such a way that, again, you're either using it as a tool of that, or you're letting reality speak for itself. Because like people are so used to artifice and social contrivance and that being used to control them, that ends up being the barometer of something. Like whether you socially contrive or overcompensate is what's defining. Like, so what I call the conscience of contrivance. In other words, people would have issue with the process and its unsound and its unqualified empirical authority and its monopolization over means and nature. They would have an issue with that if they thought about it, but they're in like a half-mass subversive state where they really don't think about it. And so now it kind of bread and circuses mentality. So now what happens? What happens is they accept it, but conditional on, well, if they keep up the right appearances, we'll go along with it. Or, oh, if they socially overcompensate or are nice or something like that, we'll go along with it. It's like you're rejecting that basis even at your own expense. You don't want that to be the case, but then it'll be specified and personalized. That's your fault. You're just exposing the nature of the process. That shouldn't be necessary, right? Social contrivance is only necessary then as a tool to specify and reinforce a specific thing that otherwise would not exist or be unqualified. Similar to branding or logos, labels and stuff. It's like it's just an inherent process, but now you're putting a name to it. You're putting a specific thing to it to try to exploit and benefit from something that's just inherent in nature. Right? There's no basis. There's no original basis to do. Where you can compete over the spoils of some unqualified forced basis, but it's kind of a difficult concept to explain, but social contrivance wouldn't be necessary, right? If it's a sound process, it would speak for itself. So it's like you're competing for something, like who can socially overcompensate for a flawed process that we all concede to a monopolization over means of something, right? Like we just concede to all of that, right? Like all of nature is monopolized, everything in the world is just monopolized. We just concede to that. Okay, you just accept that, and now it just becomes, well, who can be the nicest in reinforcing that monopolization? Or who can be the keep up the best appearance and performative aspects with that, which again is evidently revealing something that people would have an issue with that process if they just simply thought about it. The fact that it's conditional and relies on that, versus a process that would speak for itself, that it would be sound or they'd be at peace with. So they're kind of subject to a forced, unqualified empirical authority monopolization over means, nature itself. So it comes to a secondary element. It's a subversive state that they would have an issue with, that requires constant reinforcement through externality, social contrivance, overcompensation, right, distraction. complementarity. Right, like whatever stains you might be seeing there are not on the outside. It's a weird duality of value that people have. Here's a great example. Like, suppose you valued everything in life, or your life, or something else, like human life as a whole, amalgam theory, a measure that you have, all full value all the time. So it wouldn't be about your own zero-sum self-interest or overcompensation. It'd be about, like, okay, you value something, yourself, human life, amalgam theory, measure, so fully that your life is in totality. So it's not about you, it's about that. So you'd be fully committed to that all the time and stuff like that. Versus you can see it in non-value subversive state that then comes down to but then would have no credibility. It's like, oh, there is no base of value. Everything's just non-base of self, folly, favoritism, escapism, social contrivance, appearance, artifice. That's fine, but then you have no credibility to outwardly insist or have some sort of structure around other people, right, telling people what to do. So either you have that absolute measure value, even then you can't project and assume intent of others. So there's always that bypassing of, like, you're reacting to your indoctrination of a specific contrivance state, and you're treating that as absolute and just not thinking about it. And then the flip side of that is, people can't face reality except in folly, favoritism. The irony of that, like, true value or potential or truth, there's more truth in fiction than there is in reality. You get to expose or experience your full potential or freedom in some sort of folly, favoritism form, like a sport, or like, oh, you can really use that as an outlet for your passion, which you can't do and otherwise, because your life is restricted and limited in every way. So you need things that aren't fully controlled the way that, anything of importance would be. It's kind of like not based on anything, and so it's treated as a false absolute, bypassing critical thinking, especially indoctrination in youth, and then constant reinforcement. So through an established structure, and so then it comes down to who can keep up appearances the best, but it's not absolute, right? But there's kind of an incentive in that. But again, absolutist, objective, kind of inherent reality would be those things don't really matter, or it's kind of ironic. What is like false meaning and means? What's the purpose of life? Oh, it's to enjoy good foods and to, do things that. So that, in other words, the meaning of life is to sustain life, right? Tied to survival. I mean, those are things you didn't choose to have to do, and they're only necessary to sustain life. So that's not really the meaning of it. You kind of have an overcompensative hedonistic quality, but even that's part of nature's way of inspiring those things, like, the meaning of life is love, which is based on the hedonistic sexual kind of inherent tendency. That's nature's way of inspiring reproduction. Like, that, to find meaning in that, or anything similar, is kind of missing the point, because those are things that are wired to sustain itself. Like, okay, that's done, that's pleasurable to try to promote reproduction, or food, and, eat good food and do things like that. But those are all just a zero-sum process. Like, you can let reality speak for itself, and then one of the things is kind of like the artificial terms of the game of society or contrivance. Like, everything is just artificial and made up. Language itself is not an inherent thing. Names of places, of people, of whatever established structure is. So you acknowledge it, but it's only as real as as it's acknowledged to be. So it's kind of like, it doesn't matter because that stuff is actually real. So it comes down to like your inability, like, oh, somebody's stupid, or somebody somehow they'll be labeled with some psychological condition if they see the difference between inherent reality and the artificial contrivance. Like, yes, they can go along with it, they can tolerate it, but they're always aware. And what I call like the self-actualizing from an inherent based state, you're always aware, like, oh, all of this is kind of artificial and made up, by the way. It might be useful to, like, currency, or like, you know, names of places, or even countries, or just lines on a map. It might be useful to pretend those things are real to a degree, but there's a difference, right? That's the initial mind versus the larger process of like, okay, you just take that as absolute and serious, and that's it. You know, constant kind of cognitive dissonance, conflict of contrivance with the fact that it isn't absolute. What is this exit? Just 11, 1 mile. It doesn't have a name, but no, it's like, the point is, you treat it as absolute, right, versus somebody who's aware that nothing is absolute, that everything is artificial, right, that's man-made. So it could be very well man-made, very layered over generations, over time. It could be, so that creates a conflict here of like appeasing that. Like, it doesn't make it real or validated, the fact that something is established by people, because by that logic, anything could be established by people. You know, World War II Germany could be established by people. China right now could be established by people. Anything could be established, right? Pagan religions could be established. So, right, that doesn't really validate anything, but then since it's already established, you feel the need to appease it or reinforce it. So it's kind of like the innocence or the unconditionality of somebody who has no ego, who has no incentive, who has no, you know, don't associate their ego with a contrivance state. Like some outsider, oh, they've lived in like Tarzan or something. They've lived in the jungle their whole life. So now all the things you value will be revealed as conditional to the contrivance state. Oh, don't you know the name of this place? It's obvious. It's not an inherent reality. It's not real. It's just man-made. It's just artificial. You can acknowledge it. You can kind of go along with it, but it arguably doesn't even serve a purpose. And you're right, it's more about the acquiescence to a contrivance state rather than some inherent value or reality. So that human layered kind of contrivance is treated as something more, like it really doesn't have any inherent value, but right, you just kind of go along with it. There's a difference between inherent reality and value and the artificial contrivance. And like the acquiescence to a contrivance state. It's like, oh, somebody comes, they've lived in the jungle their whole life, and they could be more adept with survival skills and things like that than you are, but yet you would turn your nose at them and kind of, well, aren't you familiar with all these things that are just artificial and man-made and not real and inherent in nature? And aren't you, you know, why aren't you doing all these things that are only necessary to cope with the contrivance state, like social contrivance and appearances and stuff like that? They're only necessary to cope with that contrivance state that you're in, that person wasn't in and therefore didn't need. It was kind of like the conflict of solitude, or how it's perceived, right? Like, oh, if somebody's alone on a deserted island and they're living and they're surviving and they're doing what they're doing, that's somehow a negative, right? Like, oh, they'd be considered crazy or they'd be considered bad by society, but that just shows you, oh, you can't be free. You're not allowed to do that. All they're doing is surviving, hunting, fishing, doing what needs to be done, not needing other people, right? So that shows you like the predatory nature of collective contrivance is like they want to force you to need them so they can control you. But really, like, what if you're completely content on your own? You can fend for yourself and stuff. Now what? Like, do they want to make you weak and dependent and reliant? Right, so like what is really wrong with that case example? That person living on the island by themselves, who's content, who's at peace, who's surviving, who's fending for themselves, doing what needs to be done, right? What is wrong with that? And what's wrong with that is that they're free, and freedom isn't allowed in a contrived state, so it has to be condemned and everything that goes along with it. And like, oh, they'd be crazy or something. That just means they see objective reality and truth versus what the contrived state needed to be controlled in as a collective mass, right? So it's just that you're free and you're not allowed to be free, and freedom is bad. Religion kind of speaks similarly. It's kind of like, oh, you'd have to justify certain things that are just inherent freedoms and abilities that you have that evidently God would have created in you in the first place. But they're somehow bad. You have to somehow justify the inherent rather than you have to justify the inherent and seek permission instead of it being justified, like why you shouldn't do it, why you can't do it. Like a tendency inherently rather than some specific harm, like that tendency overall you cannot do because it could potentially be negative rather than actually doing harm with it, right? That this gets overextended. So you're controlled by your potential, not by what you actually are doing. Like, that's the difference. Oh, like, it should be illegal to hurt people. Okay, but that's not how the law works. It's illegal to even possess something that, could potentially hurt somebody. Or, to do something that could potentially, like, just to be free enough to, now you could potentially do something. Right? Not that you actually have done something wrong. Peace with their own nature. We try to blame something else, influence, externality, means, machination. And then you also have a situation where there's like an imagery I almost want to pose as I'm doing this too, like the long form posture, like somebody's doing this and they're like talking and they're explaining this and they're doing it all day, every day, and they're writing about it or whatever they're doing. And then other people are being all vain or petty about it, like, look at this person, they think they're so smart. And then the next day they see them, listen to them, and like, look at this person, they're talking about this subject. Or then the next day, look at this person, they're doing this, they must be doing it because of this reason and this thing in their childhood. And then they try to personalize it, attribute it, influence, even though everything could be done that way. And then the next day, they're talking about this subject because of this reason, blank. They try to attribute and explain away everything. But then they keep doing it every day, on and on, long form posture. Now you realize, wait a second, we're not personalizing thought anymore. We're not, so like, it's just about the objective basis or something more. So it's not about them. So what happens is, the pretense of functionalism, which itself is X is 0 sum means, is is used as a pretense and a cudgel to prevent thought, basically free thought. One of the other things I could explain is I'm kind of already tired. Let's just enjoy the ride. I gotta watch that movie Send Help, because I'm speaking about inherent man and stuff like that. Is it out yet or what? Ruins the the other things I would address is the fact that, again, like the same basis by which people are controlled, you would have to appeal to even to free them. Like the ego-based cult of personality, appearance, pretense, stimuli, acme. So even in observing those things, they're projected as if they apply to you. So it's kind of the funny way that the limerence siphon manifests. Like you're not even trying, you don't even consider other people credible in that way, or anybody credible in that way. So it's like you're observing the nature of the process, but they're framing the process and projecting it in a certain way. Like, so in other words, reality and truth don't matter. They're seeing it the way they need to see it to cope with the contrived state that they're in. Right? It doesn't matter. Like, that's nothing to do with reality, or it's a reaction to reality. You might think, oh, that's useful, but that's still not even the point. Like, it might be useful, but it's not inherent reality or objective, so there's no basis to force it on other people. Right, you really can't do that. Because at a certain point it becomes a trivial, individualized basis, so you realize, even if you go along with the contrived state, you're being controlled. Like, oh, you love your partner and they're the only one for you. That's just a way to gratify you, so you're controlled, and it's easier to control by society and whatever. But people treat it as like a lofty, gratifying thing, which is a good way to control people, appeal to their ego. No, it's not just a construct like marriage to try to control you, make it easier to organize society. No, it's love, it's meant to be, so you appeal to your ego to control you. But the point is, even if you buy into that, you can't really tell other. Okay, so one individual says, you know what, I just don't care about that. I don't want to base my life around sex and all that, so I don't do it. Or so they don't care about that, or they're free and absolutist, and they're gonna sleep around with countless people and be promiscuous. Like, on an individual basis, you really can't say anything. It's more just about the collective basis. Like, well, if everybody did that, it would be bad. Or if but so what? Who cares about everybody? That's kind of how it's looked at. Like, you're subject to this collective subversive state in a finite zero-sum existence, versus, oh, you just choose it for yourself, or you just do what you want. Right, you're not telling other people what to do, but that's the difference between contrivance and the inherent objective thing. You're not telling other people what to do, but they are not only telling you what to do, but they're outwardly insisting, indignantly insisting. This is where social contrivance and things like that, they're in an unqualified, empirical, overextended state that has no real basis. Even the basis, like, let's say you're growing up, you're 5 years old, and it's like this deference fallacy of like, oh, but that's established, that's why it's okay, it's established. But is that really a fair basis? Like, well, it was established before you even were born. You didn't establish it, you didn't have a chance in that. You didn't have a chance to establish something else, or prevent it from being established, so you would just go along with whatever's established no matter what, which might seem like a cute idea, but that, again, reinforced World War II Germany then, or whatever you picked your poison. Like, so it's a weird, established validation, preconceived basis doesn't really have credibility to it, but you just go along with it because you're a mindless sheep. That's fine. So always like the indignant insistence, outward insistence, like that's what social contrivance is. That's what egotism is. Oh, your ability to overcompensate or keep up with performative aspects. What if the goal is to be free of that, or to not do that? Or what if the goal is to just what if the goal is to remove the need, so you're sacrificing, but that's somehow negative because people are selfish and they do have an incentive, whether it be through social contrivance, whether it be they're outwardly insisting on, like, oh, let me try to explain it exactly how I mean it. Look at this person, they're being rude to people, they're being all neutral, or oh, look at this person, they're not reinforcing something socially, right? but that means that you're going along with whatever is established. So like, look at this person not reinforcing this unqualified empirical authority state that was originated in force and is arbitrary, or, you know, is a multinational corporation ravaging the land and stuff, or a government committing war crimes. Like, look at this person not socially reinforcing those things, as if that's your issue, not that maybe it's not absolute. The fact that that's necessary, like, why do you owe that in service of it? You can be free. So there's that one line from some AI video about, like, what would the devil do to try to corrupt people? And one of the lines is really stupid and kind of backwards. It's like, oh, for a man with no tribe is easiest to control. It's kind of the opposite. You're controlled by your tribe and defined by it, whereas somebody with no tribe, okay, you're free, so you don't have to take any responsibility for the government, or, you know, associate your identity with the private state. You're just free. And you might think you owe something back to contrivance, but that would only be said by those who irresponsibly preserve the stimuli acme without thinking about it. But so that's why it'd be a net neutral, like, oh, entitlement. It's like, you know, yes, you're entitled to be free of contrivance and to not be defined by it. Right, that you didn't choose, didn't create. You could argue you perpetuate it in a manner, but you're kind of reliant on it. But that shows you the weakness of people, that their nature is kind of compliant and they just kind of go along with stuff, but mindlessly. But the have-nots functional as contrivance state for something else, for objectivity, for truth, for reality. Would you do that? So like, oh, look at this person not socially reinforcing this contrivance state. Is like, but that's so it's their fault, not even the fault, but like, it's not that that's an unqualified state. It's that, oh, it's their fault for not reinforcing it. Right, so that's like an emperor has no clothes fallacy. Like, it's your fault, never the fault of the contrivance state itself. Right, it's like kind of coping with contrivance. Like, it's their fault for it's their fault for doing it. Or like, it's their fault for not overcompensating for the flawed process, not that it's flawed, or again, exclusionary to everything else, not exclusionary to everything else. It just is, but it's kind of arbitrary. So that's where the egotism comes in, of like some sort of overcompensated basis of like competing who can overcompensate best and keep up appearances. Versus like, if you're aware of the nature of the process, appearances wouldn't mean anything to you. And if you sacrifice and reject the ego basis, even that'll be projected as ego, like you need ego permission, or, oh, look at this person being all arrogant. Not that you reject the ego basis. So that's the assumption, is like the absolutist seeking finality versus the half-mass human function trying to reinforce a regurgitated contrivance state. So what happens is, oh my god. Like, here's the concept that I talk about, like, you know, the absolutist would create what others take seriously at face value. Like, you'll actually, it's almost like a shock to the system kind of a thing, but people would take seriously a contrivance state in the sense that you kind of reinforce anything, no matter what it is, and treat it as absolute and default, take for granted. That's what social contrivance is. Not only is it not credible, but it kind of is necessary to reinforce just whatever is established, no matter what. But it's a situation where benefited social contrivance and ego and an overcompensated and reinforcing contrivance state is the benefit, versus objectivity. There is no real benefit, but it'll be framed as like, oh, like your inability to do this absolute contrivance state, not that it isn't absolute, or oh, like the permission to do something that you inherently can do anyway. So what I want you to understand is the fact that what was I just saying? I bet I should have to go back and listen. Hang on a second. I actually lost track of what I was saying, but like I can't go back in the video, and for some reason I can't scroll back in the live, but that's with the social pressure and stuff like that, that's self-fulfilling and kind of arbitrary, but also, you know, relies on appearances, things like that, right? But if it's not about the self, it's about the standard, versus people coping with their contrivance state that they're in, which would seem to validate anything. So it's like sacrificing that for objectivity. So like, what is there really to gain from it? So that's why the collective contrivance or everything seems to make itself necessary by like, oh, you need it or you rely on it, but you really don't. A lot of things are in excess, a lot of things are just convenience, overcompensation for the contrivance state in the first place, but a lot, you know, controlled by half inherent, something that would otherwise just be an inherent reality tendency, but also everything has to be gone through them, like the middlemen of society, the way that like monopoly over nature and stuff like that is like, you would be free. You could deal with it yourself, but you have to do it through the contrivance state, which again people cede to for convenience, comfort, bread and circuses, but there's no real basis to it. So it's more like, again, this inherent freedom, self-actualization argument versus like a coping with contrivance state of like, you know, the basis is bread and circuses. The basis is like, oh, it would be negative to you if you didn't have zero-sum means. But like, it would only be negative to contrivance. You just wouldn't tolerate it then being told what to do, and you would just do whatever you want. So it's like, would it really be negative to you if you didn't have zero-sum means or some possible benefit or overcompensation? No, it would be negative to the contrivance state, because okay, then you won't tolerate being restricted and trained like an animal if you didn't have some bread and circuses, even if like entitlement, but that's part of what comes with preserving the stimuli acme. So that's why those who are indoctrinated rely on the form, they rely on the appearance but they take it seriously and define themselves by it. Again, as if to care about their own egotistical internal perception of it, like, oh, I can cope with this contrivance because it appears good on the surface, never mind the reality, or I can, right, the actual nature of the process. So that's sort of the misframing of like the objective, inherent, neutral, sacrifice everything, self-sufficient, not really allowed to do that, but versus the dependent over extended pretense, the incentivized, the controlled, the reinforced, the, ego basis of it, basically. I've been having such a sugar craving these last couple of days because I can feel like I can finally eat sugar, so it's kind of annoying because, again, I had my teeth removed a couple of weeks ago, but now let me demonstrate half-mass hedonism. But no, it's like, you would take the contrivance state seriously, but then, it requires constant reinforcement and constant, whatever, and then it's like, it also requires please don't tell me it's still muted. No, it's not. That's so annoying. Like, I was so disciplined for a while, and then let's see if this place. This is an interesting town. So this is Central Square, New York, a pretty small town, a pretty obscure town, but it has like a lot of stuff in here, which is kind of surprising. Like, I swear, the population of the town itself is not nearly enough to support what is here, like a Walmart and all these other things. I guarantee you, it's because of it's on a major road at an area even where like people come from all other small towns around and stuff, but yeah, is this place even open or what? I guess it must be. But yeah, like you can look at everything relative to that, like it's only relative to how you're controlled. It doesn't have any inherent real value to it. It's just right. So, and also that corresponds, like there's no ego in anything. Everything's just zero-sum process, zero-sum self-interest, whatever. Often indicating overextended subversive state. But what it also means is that, like, the kind of like it's interchangeable. Like, oh, to be really great or successful or even just inherently objectively true, you wouldn't place any special emphasis on a certain narrow nearness posture to it, even if that seems positive and people are self-insistent and kind of regressive, versus like, you know, everything's the same everywhere. It's kind of just, you don't place any special emphasis on it. And then the other part of that is the fact that one of the considerations with that would be like, oh, the inability to acquiesce to a contrivance state. But the problem with that is the fact that like, oh, it was always this person's inability or lack of social contrivance, not the fact that it's necessary, which shows you it's an artificial contrivance state that's conditional on that overcompensation. Not necessarily even saying it's bad, but that it's conditional, meaning you could overcompensate for any state then by being positive or social overcompensation and reinforcement. But the fact that that's necessary shows you it's not absolute exclusionary to everything else. So the fact that you're specifying that as a non-choice reaction to an established unqualified empirical authority, even by your own standard, that you would have cognitive dissonance with it if it wasn't overcompensated for on the social level. And so the point is that, you know, at some point you get past the personalization and just to the objective reality. But you can get trapped by that. It's kind of like, oh, was it their inability to do that social contrivance, or was it their unconditionality, that they don't have an ego, they don't have... It's not about them. It's not about their own gratification. It's not about coping with contrivance. It's about truth. It's about objective reality, despite the contrivance physical state. Like, that's the way that I would describe it. And so, like, that's kind of part of it too. Is like, of course it would be. Of course, you would struggle to socially reinforce and overcompensate for the contrivance state if you either don't vouch for the contrivance state, you're aware of the nature of the process, you have cognitive dissonance with it. Like, of course, you wouldn't be doing that, right? Like that, those two would be sort of tied together, right? That's kind of the emperor has his own closed framing, like inability to do a false absolute. Not that it isn't absolute, right? That's always how. It's like a defense mechanism for people in a contrivance state. Alright, so let me eat this thing here. I don't know. Like the Hershey pie. Where? But yeah, that's kind of the thing that you get, you know, people get enslaved by zero-sum means that they don't really need, but you take it for granted default. So then it comes down to, Well, it's about the level of overcompensation through zero-sum means and stuff like that that would validate yourself or a contrivance state. But really, that would apply to anything that's sort of arbitrary, so it's a non-choice reaction, and it sort of shows you you're selfish and weak and lazy, and the irony of like, oh, the middle class struggling to make ends meet kind of a thing, but they're actually struggling to overcompensate for an unqualified contrivance state. So, oh, you're too busy overcompensating for that contrivance state to address the contrivance state, like, to qualify it. Right? Like, nothing is necessary quite the way that it's framed, because like, either way, you reject the ego basis, so it'd be, if you reject the ego basis, then you realize that this is hard. The fuck? You reject the ego basis, or you then, okay, you don't take it seriously, but you appeal to it for the sake of others because that's what they value, that's what they're controlled by. So it's kind of like a weird framing. It's that, oh, somebody lacks social skills or something like that. Not that the basis of such things is artificial and egotistical. Like, imagine being, like, again, people say this about social media and stuff, but lacks self-awareness otherwise. Like, imagine, like, insisting upon yourself and gratifying yourself and, like, you see in everything the larger process versus, oh, you're gratified and ego, like, everything you say socially is egotistical, and everything you do, you're insisting upon yourself and your own gratification, stuff like that. It's not that you're vain and egotistical and controlled by that. It's that, oh, somebody lacks social skills. Like, it couldn't be a choice that they choose to be, sacrifice that ego basis and, are free in a manner. It's that, somehow it's your fault or their fault for, like, again, not adequately socially contriving or overcompensating. Right, so that's to pass off the blame to the individual. Like, it's their fault for not overcompensating for the flawed process, whether through, like, functional behavior or social reinforcement. It's the fact of your fault for, it's their fault for not overcompensating, not the fault of the flawed process. No process is ever flawed, oh, it's established, it's absolute. And then you even get some gratification or competition fallacy out of that. It's sort of signs of a trained animal instinct, like, well, you take pride in how much you've tolerated the contrivance state and struggled with it, which seems nice in a short-term sense, but what is the larger process? Okay, you struggled with the contrivance state that was flawed and unqualified and reinforced it and overcame it, but then at what point do you end the flawed process? Or do you use it as a means to perpetuate it? Like, okay, it's a flawed process, but you get gratification from struggling through it, but then, okay, then now your children shouldn't have to struggle through it. Or at what point do you remove the need and say, it's not about reacting to an unqualified, flawed contrivance state that requires overcompensation. It's trying to remove the need. Again, that's self-actualizing from an inherent base state versus overextension would be a concept here to discuss. So again, that's one of the great traps, that you get trapped in the ego basis of like your ability to overcompensate for a contrived state, or your association of your identity with the contrived state, or your, you know, whatever, gratification from doing that. The problem is, yes, in the short term you might think you have to do that, or it might be useful to do that, but in the big picture, it's like maybe it's a flawed process. Maybe the reason why you had to struggle with that or whatever is because maybe it's unsound. Maybe you shouldn't have to do that. Or like the only reason you have to do it is because it's a flawed process. So you'll reinforce it no matter what. So it's more like a bread and circuses argument. People will put up with anything if it's convenient and comfortable enough for them, which might seem gratifying, but it almost seems selfish. Like, so you're willing to look the other way or go along with any sort of artifice and flawed process, inconsistency. So you're not concerned with reality or objective truth or anything like that, standards. You're just this arbitrary reactionary human function. You're like, oh, you'll go along with anything if it's just comfortable enough for you. Zero-sum means adequate gratification specification. It's kind of like the way in which people are controlled is pretty clear. Like, oh, let's bypass critical thinking and appeal to the ego. Therefore, you feel gratified for overcompensating for a flawed process, unqualified empirical authority. Or let's appeal to ego as love. It's meant to be. It's a tempting thing to give into, and even Emperor has no code fallacy would be used here too. Like, you know, just like, oh, it's your inability. Oh, you just haven't found love, or oh, you just, you know, they'll attack you. It's tempting, but like, what if, oh, you're just being controlled by your base inherent instincts and tendency, and it's a way for society to get you to be controlled, like specified to one person. Which again, individually, if you want to do that, nobody's stopping you from doing that. You're even encouraged and pressured to do it. And even, you know, you can do it, but it's not absolute. You can't really outwardly insist, force other people to do it. It's based on control. Even if you want to acknowledge a functional basis, I always talk about that. Okay, acknowledge you're doing it because it's easier for society to control, or it's good for the family system, you know, children. But not the false absolute ego coping, because you're basically just saying that's how you're controlled. Bypassing your critical thinking. Yeah, one of the elements with that is the simple fact of, again, the absolutist, there's duality to it. Okay, I'll show you, like, the eyes of an absolutist, the perception. Oh, that, like, almost like the crazy eyes type of thing, perception. Like, you see everything, or you see something beyond what's in front of you. So, oh, you're a kid, and you could be taken to some special place, and it's like, it's the same as anywhere else to you. You see the same things in that as you do anything else. You're not that impressed by it. Right, you could just imagine that or whatever. Or in ordinary everyday things like what we could be looking at now, if my camera wasn't off, you would see the larger process in that. So, in other words, it doesn't matter. Your mind isn't restricted to externality initial basis. You see the larger process in every little thing, and you're not limited to what you see either. Like, whatever it is that's presented, like, you're not taken in just by that. You see everything else around it associated with it. So a lot of conflict of contrivance is like just coping with the contrivance state that you're in. And there's a lot of indignant insistence to do with that. And people, again, associate their identity with it and then sort of use their ego as a defense mechanism, which might seem useful, but what that means is basically they're vouching for the state, which is inconsistent even with basic practice. Like, you're vouching for the state, but you're inconsistent because you have to distract yourself, follow favoritism, subversive, etc. So that's what the absolutist or any sort of thought here would do. Like, you might say, oh, that applies to you too. But that's the point. Like, you're trying to remove the need. Like, so, oh, it's applied to you. Like, oh, you lack credibility, or oh, you whatever. You kind of just don't get it, contrivance state, even though it's ego-based, arbitrary. But what it means is that the fact that that's necessary, right? The fact that that's necessary is like, or like, again, if they vouch for the state, then they should be utopian perfect. They shouldn't need to smoke and drink and follow favoritism, escapism, subversive process, right? Those things indicate an imbalance that they're overcompensating for, but yet they still somehow are credible, vouch for it, for it, and then there's no basis to outwardly insist upon it, but they do, and they treat it as false absolute default. They've been indoctrinated into it, bypassing their critical thinking, but now they associate their identity and ego with it, so they act as an enforcer of it. So that's what every society will treat, like, oh, I'm just working hard and trying to put food on the table and this and that. But part of that is you're coping with the contrivance state. So, like, that is outward. Everything is outward. Like, no thought, no critical thinking, no credibility. So, like, why should you be inhibited by that? So, like, you'd sacrifice your own ego or, like, credibility, like, arbitrary, subversive, but they won't, because that's kind of the stupid thing. You would, again, if you think objectively, or like an absolutist kind of way that we're discussing this, you would sacrifice your, like, okay, I have no credibility, right? So you'd sacrifice that because, okay, I engage in subversive favoritism or whatever, I'm flawed, imperfect, reactionary. So you would sacrifice your own ego and credibility because you're more aware of the nature of the process and yourself and human nature and behavior. But the human functions indoctrinated by that contrivance state would not consider that. They would not sacrifice their own credibility, or they'd indignantly insist upon it because they don't think about it. So it's easy to be passionate about something full of sound and fury signifying nothing type of energy. It's easy to be passionate about something when you don't think about it deeply because you just associate it as the surface level and only look at the parts that you want to. Whereas somebody who thinks deeply and fully about it, they might value it to a degree, but they wouldn't treat it as an absolute exclusionary to everything else. So it would just be, it just is, instead of, oh, it's absolute better than other things or something. So that's what it means. So the people who support it are think about it less than people who don't specifically support it. That's all irony. You would be objective and sacrifice that appearance, pretense, basis, egotism, pseudo credibility. You sacrifice all that, try to remove the need for the process. You wouldn't tell people what to do. You're subject to it. You tolerate it. Versus the human functions would indignantly insist upon it. So it's like, oh, they have credibility and you don't, even though you're willing to acknowledge the faults of human perception and credibility and the nature of a process, whereas they're not willing to acknowledge them. But somehow that passes off as your lack of ability to do that, not that it isn't absolute. So that's where the stimuli acme preservation comes in. It's like, you can be subject to it, you can be trained like an animal, but you wouldn't perpetuate it, at least. So it's kind of a wash. You could have died sooner without supposed privilege, if you want to call it that, even though to tolerate contrivance, it'd be negative to contrivance, right, more so than the self. But you wouldn't preserve the stimuli acme because you right, wouldn't be vouching for the state. So that's the important dynamic of it. You didn't create it, and you don't have to perpetuate it. Or you also get into the spaces of like an endless specific arbitrary thing where if you make something about ego or cult of personality, then it's endless. You'll specify the conflict. Like one of my logical razors, don't specify the conflict. You'll focus on that, so it'll be endless. Like, oh, this person revealed the nature of the process by their actions. But you won't focus on the nature of the process. You'll never get to a conclusion. You're always in denial of the process. Conflict of contrivance is their issue for pointing it out or for revealing it through their actions or whatever. Not just that, okay, you're aware of that process, you come to a conclusion, finality, and move on. It shows you that you're not at peace with it, you're not aware of it. So you react on an initial basis and specify the conflict to an individual, right, or a case example, rather than addressing the thing overall. So that's like the arbitrary nature of it. It's like, it's not that, oh, you would think you're better, it's that you know that it's arbitrary, and so there's no absolute basis by which people do anything. You know, the origin point being force, reinforcement being arbitrary, overcompensated social contrivance. So, like, people would go along with anything if it was just established. Tradition shows that, history shows that, stigma effect shows that. So you would think people wouldn't be so indignant, insistent, or all that, like, and their behavior in observable practice would indicate this too. They have to overcompensate or distract or whatever. Okay, so let's get a few more concepts in here. So like, I think I discussed this one recently, but I'll do it again. Like, the exertion of an absolutist, right? Suppose somebody's living, pushing their potential to the limit and all that, like every second, every action, right, for some measure, not just non-invasive self. So, have zero-sum means, bread and circuits, and overcompensation. Because, like, that's what you have to acknowledge. Much of what you do is not necessary. Like, people don't require much to survive. A lot of it's overcompensation. So you act like, oh, it's a struggle or it's necessary, but it's really not. And so then you can make that choice, like how much you sacrifice or subvert. You treat it as a false absolute default in service of a specific contrivance state. So the point with that is that default human function mentality is good because it reinforces any state that you're in. So it wouldn't have mattered, right? That's like the lack of credibility of a mass of people. Like, you would have gone along with World War II Germany, you would have gone along with anything. Like, you're too busy overcompensating or sustaining it so in some way you have to sacrifice somebody in a position of some power, or just in general, you'd have to sacrifice yourself. Don't preserve the stimuli acme, sacrifice everything, reveal the nature of the process, right? Because, like, which is more credible, right? The one who's free of contrivance and being objective, like, oh, you're only saying that because of what? You have some privilege of zero-sum means, maybe, or you have the privilege to think and be free in your mind, which anybody can theoretically do. Or, like, you're a minimalist, but that's a choice, anybody can do. So you're free of the functional contrivance state, so you see it for what it is, versus you're subject and controlled by it, so you're only doing that from a functional perspective, right? If it's admitting you only need to do it because of zero-sum means and stuff like that, and then the potential thing is like the absolutist looks disheveled or something because they maxed out their potential, so that they sacrifice the appearance for the reality, and focus on, oh, look at their appearance or performative aspects, because you care about the illusion of a false absolute half-mass state, versus them acknowledging there is no absolute, so now they're going to maximize their potential. So it's like, and are aware of the larger process, the nature of the process. So what happens is, everything's arbitrary reactionary, so you look at it like that's the whole irony of means validation. Is like you would show how arbitrary it is, right? Like, okay, if I hit the lottery right now, then what I'm saying is more valid to people because, or whatever, like it means whatever means you have, so, or whatever other preconceived notion. But the thing is that you would sacrifice that very basis, so it's kind of self-defeating. You have to appeal to contrivance to reveal contrivance. But, the thing is, with the potential, you'd focus on the appearance, they focus on the reality and the practice. So that's the way that you control people. Is you pose a false absolute, whether it be God, whether it be some other collective social value for humanity supposedly, or some other moral pretense, and you pose that false absolute not to inspire full and free practice, absolute action and practice and value, but you do it somehow it's twisted to a half-mast state, like that would make you not, that make you content. It's like, oh, all these false absolutes, whether it be God or otherwise, lead to a nice, comfortable, cushy, bread and circuses, dependent over extended pretense, modern life with all this technology and value favoritism and excesses and all these things that would indicate an imbalance that you're overcompensating for and distracting from, right? That's neither absolute because it requires that, nor is it absolute because you're not absolutely practicing everything to your full potential. So you're in a non-value subversive state that you concede. It's a non-value state, and now it's about appearance, pretense, overcompensation. So, like, how is that possible? Because you know, so where there'd be no credibility in doing that, and versus again, like the absolute action, practice, consistent measure. So it would be this: everything is conditional, authority, etc. Everything's accountable, everything's endlessly valued and practiced. Versus the social contrivance basis to reinforce a half-mast state. It's like you would never be at peace with that because there's cognitive dissonance with it. So people aren't at peace with it anyway, but they distract and overcompensate for the fact that they're not at peace with it. Or like even the it's like if you were to play act something, right? You'd reveal to people the nature of the process, but then it's negative because it's like, you know, like, oh, it's the uncanny valley thing. It's negative if they're aware of it, but it's not negative if they do the same exact thing. So, like, again, that shows you a lot of dissonance and lack of credibility. But the thing is that have a situation where that potential would be maxed out. So it's like you're never at peace and everything's conditional. So like you're never satisfied with the contrivance state or authority or anything like that. You would constantly hold it accountable no matter what. Just like you would always be taking action and practice with a zero-sum process. There is no, again, this sort of pretense lofty meaning, but it's inconsistent because like, oh, well, we defer. We use other people to inhibit us rather than to empower us. Like, well, for the sake of other people, let's defer. For the sake of other people, let's, and that's why it's projected non-based of self-interest is what's assumed in everything, only in value, only based on value. But the thing is that value versus contrivance, you'd always have a measure, right? You'd never be at peace or satisfied with that because of the simple fact that like authority would always be conditional, held accountable, inconsistent, never absolute, and even your own life and actions would be its reactionary zero-sum half-mast. So that shows you the importance of social contrivance as a tool to counter thought, anti-thought, bypass. Thought is absolutely specified. So that's where performative aspects are disingenuous because like somebody could be honest or aware of the nature of the process, but then they're somehow responsible for the process or it's projected to them. When in reality, it's a situation where the fact that that's necessary. So it's like one person would be ignorant and not thinking and insisting upon themselves socially or whatever, versus the other one is objective and honest and unconditional. So that's negative in the performative way. So it's like the difference between being dumb and playing dumb. People would rather you be dumb. That way it seems, like that's genuine and you're really authentic with how stupid and dumb and lowest common denominator you actually are. Versus like you play down and pretend to be dumb, thereby revealing the nature of the process, but you're also aware of it at the same time. That's somehow a bad thing. So you would rather, it's easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled. They would rather you be dumb and subversive than to be aware of the nature of the process and then to play dumb. And the problem with that too is the personalization on the individual basis. Like, you would give an individual a hard time about that. Like, oh, look at this person, being aware of the nature of the process that controls us. But you wouldn't give that same grief to the contrived state, authority, people who actually have power. Like, so the person who's aware of the nature of the process is at fault, right? Who's also subject to it, etc. Versus the process itself and people with actual power and stuff like that. But that shows you the trick of a contrived state too, is like, so the enemy is this random, ordinary person who's just thinking and self-aware and etc. They're the issue. You should be afraid of them, and you should be, self-insistent, projecting, and it's, put all your negative thoughts about humanity and project them onto them because they're neutral or non or unconditional or variable or whatever, lack performative aspects. That's the issue because they break your illusion. They break your illusion or don't maintain your illusion. But it's a situation where the nature of the process. So like that is a subversive state by definition, because it's like again in the minds of the people who are part of it, evidently it's a non-value subversive state because it can't face reality directly. It can't be self-aware, it can't be fully aware, it can't think, it can't be full or consistent or true value. It's a state of constant subversion because it's like, oh, it's a false absolute and this and that. But then we have to dumb ourselves down with alcohol and distract ourselves with thought, favoritism, etc. And then we also have to, have constant contrivance, social contrivance, stigma, reinforcement, blah, blah, blah. And then the other fact of it is that you have to that you need all those things would kind of indicate something. right, versus the non-unconditional peace aware of the nature of the process. But again, this negative projection to the self. So like, you can't be aware of the nature of the process, you can't think, you require constant subversion, distraction, social contrivance, appeal to ego, bypassing critical thinking. So on an initial basis, people would, oh yeah, those are good things because they help us cope with the contrivance state. But in reality, they're bad because they overcompensate and reinforce what is evidently in their own mind, if they were aware of it, a negative state. So suppose you had, again, a reality based in self-awareness and total awareness and true value and consistent accountability and objectivity, and suppose you had a concern with truth and inherent reality and objectivity, then if you're at peace with the state, then fine. But if that was true, then you wouldn't need any of those things. Okay, you don't need to distract yourself, or polyfavoritism, escapism, entertainment, distraction, dumbing yourself down, social contrivance. You don't need all that. Or the fact that you do need that would indicate, again, that imbalance. And then finally, social contrivance is kind of like, you're aware of the nature of the process, let's say, but you defer to people who aren't, or like to the social thing. So really, social contrivance on two counts is completely without any real value or meaning. And I'll observe it like this. Again, either it's like just normative, like, well, whatever norms are set in motion originally by force, by unqualified empirical authority, by, exposure to indoctrination. Now it's a matter of, let's just reinforce them endlessly. Like, so it's just a tool of reinforcing whatever the way of life currently is, or however it came to be. You didn't even choose it, just whatever's established. It'll just reinforce anything mindlessly, right, and overcompensate for even a flawed process, stuff like that. And then the flip side of that is it will it'll reinforce anything no matter what, overcompensate, stuff like that, using like the ego self-insistent basis as a crux of the argument, because you associate your identity with it. So you could associate your identity with World War II Germany or whatever. I'm not going to explain that again, but like basically it's interchangeable, not very credible. And then the final point is the simple fact that I really get annoyed with having to repeat some of these things. That's why I'm going to start. That was my mistake in the old days of my debate format. I could have saved all this trouble if I just had fucking recorded the videos or saved them or upload, like, bro. But no, the point is that everything lowest common denominator reactionary in that way, and then what I want you to understand with that is thought versus the initial. But again, it's like it'll either, again, it's not credible because it'll reinforce anything, or no matter what, or so like uncritically just mindless reinforcement, or it will I actually forgot exactly how I explained the other part, but like basically it's only necessary, right, in a reactive way. Like if you were at peace with the state that you're in, or if something was a sound process, you wouldn't need it, is basically the point. So it's overcompensative, etc. by nature, and it's kind of like, you know, I kind of can't remember what I was going to say there. Okay, so the biggest issue I'm having with some of this when I'm doing these trips and stuff is the batteries are hard to keep charged. Those Anchor batteries are impossible because they're like, they take like 12 hours to charge. So what am I supposed to do with that? Like, when am I supposed to charge it? Like, you know, I have to charge my phone constantly when I'm driving because that charge is extremely slow. That takes like 2 hours just by itself to charge. Like, what the fuck? Everything is so slow. Like, yeah, I may as well do this and leave this as my record of Absolutist philosophy, because really, I don't want anything for it. Like, I don't want attention or anything, but it is unfortunate that it has to be done, right? As one of my characters from a short story where, like, he does all this kind of thing, similar, like, teachings and objectivity, and it's like, not only does he not want anything from it or take any pride in it, he's annoyed even that he has to do it, like what I could feel now. This is something that should be done before you ever preserve the stimuli acme, before you ever outwardly insist, before you ever, like, think this much, this, you know, be this much thought into it, and then you might have some credibility, versus the opposite, like, oh, preconceived basis, indignant insistence. Like, I don't respect that. Long-form postulate, true value, same measure, versus pretense, half-mass, self-invalidating, no credibility, right? Just, you don't, there should be some standard of that, but it's kind of treated as the opposite, right? We're thinking of somehow, oh, it's a stigma, it's a bad thing. Like, oh, you just don't get the absolute process, Emperor has no close fallacy. Like,